Today, though, we're looking at Jonathan. And Jonathan he has a special place in my heart because of really, maybe he shouldn't, but just the kind of man that he was, his character, his place. He was a rare breed. He was the eldest son of King Saul, the first king of Israel. He was the heir of the first king of Israel. That automatically puts you in a position to be many things, not many of which are good. Like puffed up, spoiled, arrogant, so many things along those lines. What's amazing about Jonathan is he was none of those things. He was someone who became, as I sort of just described, based on Proverbs 18:24, he became a friend who sticks closer than a brother. The Proverbs writer said, there is a friend. He said, a man with many friends, many companions or whatever can, come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Jonathan is the epitome of the kind of person that the Proverbs writer was talking about. He was that friend who sticks closer than a brother to David, even defying his own father to save David's life at least once, and who honored God's choice of David as the next king instead of himself. All of which are impressive. But when we put all of this together, there's more to say about Jonathan separate from David. But his legacy is basically as that friend to David who, the argument could be made that without Jonathan, David may not have ever become king. Of course, God was going to see to it. But Jonathan was one of the main instruments that God used, so to speak, to even get David to the throne. Because if Saul had his way, as we saw this morning in our Bible study, David would have been dead long before he ever got close to the throne. But we meet Jonathan in 1 Samuel chapter 13, in verse 2. We meet him as a man of war, soldier, fighter. He's going up against, it says there were 2,000 with Saul in Michmash in the hill country of Bethel. 1,000 were with Jonathan, so he had 1,000 men underneath him on this occasion. And the rest of the people he sent home, every man to his tent. Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines, so he was fighting the Philistines and was a valiant soldier, I have no doubt. And really, we meet him there, but we really meet him in chapter 14. Because this is, you see the encampment around. Saul's son Jonathan sort of says, come on, let's go over to this garrison of the Philistines. He didn't tell his dad, though. He came up with this on his own. And he takes his armor bearer. They go over there. A rocky crag on one side of it, and a rocky crag on the other side of it. I don't know about you, but if I'm Jonathan at this point, I say, you know what, never mind. Let's go home. Let's go back to the camp. I had this idea to do this, but when you got a rocky crag on one side and a rocky crag on the other side, it's time to go home. But not Jonathan. Jonathan had the idea, why don't we just climb over all this or up it, however it was laid out. And here's what he says in 1 Samuel 14:6. It may be that Jehovah will work for us, for nothing can hinder Jehovah from saving by many or by few. That says almost everything about Jonathan in one quote. He was a man of faith. He was really nothing like his dad at this point. Maybe he was a lot like his dad earlier in his dad's life. He was nothing like the way his dad had been, would ultimately, what his dad would turn into. He was a different sort. We also see how much loyalty he must have inspired whenever his armor bearer says, do whatever's in your heart. You know, I'm with you. If you want to do this, I'm with you heart and soul. Not just, hey, what am I going to tell the king's son no? That's not what he said at all. He said, I'm with you heart and soul. So he also inspired love, loyalty, and faith. And that takes a certain kind of man as well. Yeah, Dean?
Well, at the same time, Goliath, how earlier than this? Account of Goliath, he was earlier than
It was after this, yeah.
was he after this?
Goliath was after this. 1 Samuel is a few chapters later. Yeah.
I was trying to remember where he would have been at in this part. He was a Philistine, and he was one of the soldiers.
Yeah. Yeah, he must not have been at this particular base or whatever, this garrison. So this is like kind of, I guess, the main one that they were camped against at this time, like this battle, it wasn't all the Philistines, but this one garrison that was, I guess, up above where they were camped. So he's just like, hey, God can do this. Why don't you and I just go over there and do it? Because God, nothing can stop him. By many or by few. He could beat the Philistines with this whole army here, or he can beat the Philistines with you and me. And he said, all right, I'm with you, heart and soul. So they go up there, kill all of them. Jonathan was right. God delivered, God saved. He saved them. This sort of kicked off the battle. It wasn't all the Philistines in that battle, but it was this one part, and they saw it, and it sort of created chaos. And these two men, Jonathan and his armor bearer, climbed up this thing and started taking them out by the power and grace of God. About 20 men. Talk about details. Sometimes we want more details. How's this for details? Jonathan and his armor bearer killed about 20 men within, as it were, half a furrow's length in an acre of land. Anybody want to help me out what that means? Please. Because I tell you, I read those words, I have no clue what I just read. What in the world does that mean? It'd be one thing, he killed about 20 men within half a furrow's length, but I still wouldn't know what it means. But within half a furrow's length in an acre of land, it's just you keep adding these things like I have no idea. But I'll tell you what I do understand. It's impressive.
It says it's a very small area of land, roughly equivalent to half the width of a single plow furrow.
You lost me already again, see?
Within a plot of land that's considered to be one.
Too many prepositional phrases.
An acre is 43,560 square.
Now you're just throwing numbers.
Just a single plow furrow. That's not.
How big is it?
Well, it says they killed them within half a furrow's length in an acre of land.
The width of a single plow furrow.
I just don't understand the second prepositional phrase. I figured half a furrow's length is the same whether or not it's in an acre of land. So I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I'm just kidding anyway. But
Very small area of land. So,
okay, yeah.
Acre is small, so it's half that.
well, it's way less than it's just a little piece of that.
The point is there wasn't much between it. So two men take on about 20 men, sort of all there together. So it's just the more, it's even more impressive. 2 on 20 is impressive, but it's not like one here and then we go down here, kill another, then we go. That's 2 on 1, 20 times. But this was more like they were all, right here together. So it's like 2 on 20, and so that's the point. I was just making a. Detailed. It's pretty detailed, more detailed than we're normally accustomed to, in a lot of times.
One of the neat details prior to that, Jonathan had to have consulted the Lord before he said, "Let's go get him," because he gave 2 scenarios. If they say this, we don't go get him. But if they say come,
Yeah.
then the Lord will have given him to us. So he had already checked with God people went up to Ai, they forgot to ask God before they did anything. And so
Never a wise choice.
that's
Yeah.
your first step, always check with God.
Either way, whether he had explicitly, consulted with God, which it doesn't say explicitly, but he at least understood this is going to be God's doing regardless. So whatever led him to this specific, if they say this, then we won't. We'll stay and not go up. If they say this, then for whatever reason he understood that will mean that Jehovah they're ours, basically, and we will go up. So something led him to believe that them saying "come on up" would be a sign from Jehovah that he will deliver them into. So even in that, regardless of why he thought that, there was still the implication of, if this happens, that means God doesn't want us to do this, and therefore we're not going to do it. So there's even that in Jonathan. So as opposed to, like going up to Ai, where they had in their minds what they were going to do, period. And, regardless of whether God wants them to or not. So that's the first specific thing that we see Jonathan doing, and it says so much about him already. But the more we learn about him, the more we admire him, especially when David comes into the picture. But I guess the next little thing about Jonathan is Saul makes a very rash vow, and he says, "Not a single man of you is going to eat anything until all these Philistines are dead. Until this war's over, more or less." So none of them ate. Again, not advisable for your soldiers to not be eaten. Jonathan was away, obviously. He was busy. Didn't know about it. So he, as they're walking by, he sees some honey and he gets some and he eats some of the honey. And the people are like, "Oh, no, you can't do that." By the way, he said, whoever does will die, is the implication, death penalty. Well, here Jonathan eats some. And Jonathan says, rather than, of all the things he could have said, what he said was, "My father has troubled the land. My dad is not being the best king he could be. He's not, that was not a smart thing for him to do." That would have taken some courage to say. It seems to suggest that he said it out loud. I mean, he openly said this, not just he thought it to himself. But even if he thought it, that at least shows a lack of partiality and the foresight to see, even though he's my dad, I can see when he does something wrong. Whereas some people, whether subconsciously or otherwise, they blind themselves to the faults of some close to them, and they make excuses for it, or, hey, he's the king, it's his prerogative. But no, Jonathan understood and was not afraid to acknowledge, this is not right. And so on and so forth. And they basically saved Jonathan's life, which shows, again, just like with his armor bearer, love, loyalty. He inspired these things. So they basically rose up to say to the king, mind you, "As Jehovah lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day." So, over your dead body, O king, will you turn him into a dead body. You will not lay a hand on him, even though he broke your little command about eating. So that says a lot about Jonathan too. So even some things that that other people are doing also say a lot about Jonathan, just because of how much people loved him and cared for him. Almost like this is a man that I can get behind. This is a man, there's no doubt, Jonathan would have made an amazing king. Just as good as David, I don't have any doubt. Maybe even better. But it wasn't in God's That wasn't the way of things. Yeah, Dean?
Well, thing is, like in a war, like Jonathan, he probably gets hungry and weak, and he knew that honey was something that would give him the energy that he needed. And it's just a normal thing to do.
Yeah.
He just reached down and got it.
Walking by, hey, free food, here we go.
He needed it, and that's what they should have done too. I mean, it was something that they were in a battle,
Yeah,
and you got to have your strength. If you don't have your strength, you're going to lose.
yeah, they're getting weak, faint, and, when Jonathan, see, he wasn't there to hear his dad say it, but they told him, and he immediately was like, that's foolish, this is not good. And he takes it even farther, like, he's troubled the land. I mean, yeah.
Well, that's because whenever Jonathan got there, the men won the battle against the Philistines.
Mhm.
But Jonathan knew they didn't have any pleasure in it because they were faint with hunger. They were so hungry, they ate animals with the blood in it.
Yeah.
And they had to offer sacrifice.
And that was Saul's fault,
Exactly.
ultimately,
Jonathan saw
yeah.
all of this. He had to have seen it's like, I mean, they didn't go as far as Jeroboam, but his death cost him to
Yeah, his silly vow. I mean, they were to blame for breaking the law, but his vow led them to that. At least contributed to that, to they shouldn't even have been in that position, but because of him. So so far, Jonathan is he's super popular. He's the king's son. He's an amazing warrior. He's a man of faith. He's inspired all this loyalty and love and faith, inspired faith in God. He is he's the man, okay? Now, in comes this shepherd boy from the country named David. We talked about David in chapter 16. He's a secretly anointed king. Chapter 17, he goes to see his brothers. There's this giant who's taunting and challenging one-on-one combat. David says, I'll do it. He kills the giant. David's now the most famous man in the country. And he's brought into the city, the royal city. Now, under most circumstances, how do you think Jonathan is going to view this guy? Yeah, exactly the way Saul does. Eventually. He's a threat. Hey, I used to be that guy. I used to be the one that people talked about. I used to be the one who people admired and looked up to. Nobody's singing songs about Jonathan out in the streets, but they're singing them about David. Saul has struck down his thousands. David is 10,000. They couldn't even put Jonathan in there. Jonathan struck down his hundreds. Could put him in there. David is now the hero. But here's the amazing thing. In chapter 18, it says, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, that is David, introducing himself, I'm the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. It says, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. That to me is one of the most powerful verses about John, even more so than chapter 14. The fact that this is the way Jonathan looked at David. He didn't hate him. He wasn't jealous of him. He wasn't, wanting to compete with him or look down on him in any way. He loved him as his own soul. His soul was knit to David's soul. Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And verse 3 says, he made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. He stripped himself of the robe that was on him, gave it to David. He took his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt, and gave it to David. And it has been suggested that was a token of Jonathan's understanding already that David was going to be the next king. Should have been Jonathan. From all human, that's the way of kings, and why they have a king in the first place, because we want to be like the nations, and they have a king, and guess who's next? The king's son's next. Jonathan's that man, and he was so qualified. But Jonathan knew, it seemed as soon as he met David, it's you. How did he come to that? I don't know. But he knew. And he would say it later. And he had plans. By the way, Jonathan's story is a tragedy. It's a tragedy. Yeah, Dean, do you have something?
Well, like you said, with Jonathan, he had that relationship there, and the thing of it is, he knew that David was going to be the next king.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, whether he was there when God told Saul, because of what he disobeyed God, and he was no longer, the kingdom was not going to be passed on to his sons. Now, I don't know if he was there or not at that time. But anyway, we know that God told Saul that his descendants was not going to be the next king.
Yeah, he'd already been told, yeah. But he resisted, he wasn't buying that. I mean, he wasn't having it. And eventually Saul does say, I don't have the place marked, but he does say, he in some way he suggests to Jonathan, if I don't do something, he's going to take it from you. If the kingdom has to go to you. And, that was a pride thing, if nothing else, because it wasn't so much that he loved Jonathan so much as Jonathan was Saul's son, and the kingdom must belong to us. Yeah.
And too, you know that it was told to Saul that his sons were going to be killed.
Yeah.
That's the sad thing about Jonathan. He was, doing what was right, but yet we know that eventually he was going to die before David came.
Yeah. And we'll see that. And what were you going to say, Angie?
Well, when Saul had the dinner and that he expected David to be at, when he and Jonathan cooked up a plan about, David says, I know your father wants to kill me, and Jonathan said, I don't think so, I'll find out.
Yeah.
I mean, when his dad nearly pins him to the wall, he pretty much said at that time, if you cover for this guy, he's going to take your kingdom.
Yeah, that's the place I was thinking of, yeah.
And see, I think Saul was still only thinking of himself and was trying to reason with, or not reason, but try to cause Jonathan to turn against David. But all along, Jonathan cared for everyone around him and not just himself. And he had to have seen his father's mental abilities devolve into fits of anger and rage and all of that. I mean, Jonathan was aware and cared for others, not just David,
Yeah.
but never cared for himself.
He cared about what's right. That's the thing. Whatever it was, and what's wrong. And so whenever, he loved David, they were again, friend that sticks closer than a brother to David, because I highly doubt Jonathan had this kind of relationship with his actual brothers, but he had this relationship with David, because they had a kinship in spirit, in heart, and that goes without mentioning how Jonathan understood that David was going to he was anointed to be the next king. But here's the thing, chapter 19 says, Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan delighted much in David. Okay, now he's now what? I'm best friends with this guy David, but Dad is saying to kill him. Well, some men might have said, David, there's no hard feelings, no, it's not personal, but what am I supposed to do? My dad's the king, and he's told me this. I mean, he's the king, not Jonathan. It says, first of all, Jonathan told David, my dad wants to kill you. But then he goes beyond that, and he goes to his dad. And verse 4 says, chapter 19, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, and I'll paraphrase, He hasn't done anything, Dad. Leave him alone. This is not right. What you are wanting to do to him is not right. Not only has he not wronged you and sinned against you, but his deeds have brought good to you. He's done good things for you. For he took his life in his hand and he struck down. He reminds him, have you forgotten what David did? Well, this worked for a bit. Saul listened to Jonathan. But still, it shows a lot about the character of Jonathan. Going to his dad and saying, this is not right. What you're wanting to do is wrong. So he kind of put his own life in his hands. Okay, so chapter 20, verse 30 is Saul. That's when he finally turns on Jonathan for sure, calling him a dirty name, sort of. As long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. So there's Saul's mindset. Jonathan's mindset was always on what's right. What is right? What's the right thing? What's the wrong thing? Who the actors are is irrelevant. And that's how it should be with us too, by the way. That's what not impartiality means. Wrong is wrong, right is right, and if somebody's doing wrong, it should be called wrong, and if somebody does right, it should be called right. Even if it's my father, even if it's the king. Jonathan was one of those that the lines did not get blurred. He knew, hey, this thing is wrong. I don't care who wants it. Whether it's some jailer somewhere who hates David and trying to hire people to kill him, or whether it's the king himself who happens to be my father, it's wrong to want to kill David because he hasn't done anything. So Saul, it works, and this is where we saw this morning, it didn't work for long because he's still trying to kill him. And Jonathan finally warns David, and they make this vow to, we'll meet here. I'm gonna make sure and see, sort of put my father to the test and see, and if he has not changed his heart and mind, then I'll let you know. And if he does, then I'll let you know. So they had that plan worked out about the bow and the arrow and all that. So turns out he stands up for David again, and Saul flips out on him. He calls him it says Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman." We have a similar saying as that in our language. It's pretty much what he's saying. "Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" What in the world's that got to do with anything? In other words, you don't think I know that you've chosen David over your own father? What is this obsession you have with David, this son of Jesse? What about me? Well, it wasn't about that for Jonathan. It was about right and wrong. Yeah, Dean?
Well, we see the contrast between Saul and Jonathan in the fact that faith. One had faith in God and the other one didn't. Because Saul, when he was told to go out to war there, he didn't believe in God. He lost his faith.
Yeah.
And now Jonathan, all the time when we see him, he has faith in God all the time. Time and time again, showing that the faith that Jonathan had in God.
Yeah.
Saul didn't have that faith, but Jonathan did.
Yep, absolutely. That's one of the reasons why he would have made such a great king. But his father he blew all that. He ruined it. But if you remember this morning, I said whenever his wife helped him out of the house, sneak out of the house, it began anywhere between 5 and 10 years of him running around, having to run here and there and hide from Saul. Well, there were a few occasions when Jonathan and David made arrangements to meet at some place for Jonathan to sort of give him an update or whatever. And, this marked a very significant event because now Saul is hurling his spear at Jonathan. the same way. I mean, now Jonathan is, and so it says, so Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. He knew nothing was going to change it. So he got up. He went out to David to tell him, you got to go. You got to run. It's not safe to come back. And so David's going here and there. He's living in caves. And, a lot of the things that happened in David's life that we reflect on took place during this exile. But in chapter 23, they meet up again. And it says, this is where Jonathan, he makes this, I guess, a sort of covenant again. But he says, he reveals his plans to David. Here we get to see what was inside Jonathan's heart, what he had in mind for the future. He knew he wasn't going to be king. But he said, it says, Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. You could probably make a sermon out of that all by itself. Jonathan strengthened David's hand in God. And he said to him, do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel. Okay, we've already seen that implied, but here's the next part, the sad part. And I shall be next to you. This was Jonathan's view of this is what he wanted. You're going to be the king, I know that. But I'm going to be by your side. I'm going to be your right-hand man. I want to be with you. I'm going to be your, whatever you want me to be, your servant, a leading man in the army like I am now or whatever. I'm going to be next to you. And Saul, my father, knows this. That's what makes the story of Jonathan such a tragedy, because that never happened. Because of Saul's rebellion and downfall, Jonathan was collateral damage in the downfall of his father. So, Jonathan doesn't really appear much anymore. That may be, at least it's close to the last time we see Jonathan. And David sees Jonathan. Let me double check that. I think that was the last time David ever saw Jonathan. The last words they had with each other was Jonathan more or less saving his life again by at least informing him, you're in danger and whatnot. But you shall be king, you're going to be the next king, and I'm going to be with you. They made a covenant. And then he has to leave. The next thing that David hears about Jonathan is that he's been killed by the Philistines. That's chapter 31. The death of Saul, the prophecy that Samuel gave him was fulfilled. And sadly, Jonathan was not spared. So, he brought down his whole house. The good thing, though, is we know that Jonathan was very faithful and to the very end. So it makes it a little less tragic, but it's still sad because you think back and his whole view of the future was, I want David to be the next king because God wants him to be the next king, but I want to be with him, right there next to him. And can I just make a comment that let me find the verse here. Actually, I don't know if I can find the verse, but in a quick fashion. But the whole statement about how, 2 Samuel 1:26, when David is lamenting Jonathan, and he says, very pleasant you have been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. And some people have made a thing out of this like they were gay. It's just absolutely disgusting and ridiculous. That is not in any way what anything suggests. The point was, Jonathan was better to David than anybody ever was. even more than any woman. And this was a married man. And he's saying, what you have done for me and brought to my life is more than anybody else that's ever been in my life. As far, not God, but any other person. Yeah, Dean?
Well, to me, I think I can see here that, Jonathan had to die because of the fact that if he would have survived, there would have been some of the children.
The kingdom would have been torn, yeah.
Make him the king, and there would be an opposition. And he wouldn't have wanted it.
Yeah.
But the people there would do it.
Even though Jonathan would have worked tirelessly to stop that, saying, I'm not, don't make a movement for me. This is my king. It probably wouldn't have helped with a lot of them. They still would have said, you are the king's son. You're my king, not this shepherd guy, this shepherd boy. Or even there may have been sincere confusion, like, well, wait, you're the king, you're the heir, and so this is not right. So it's just a tragic story of Jonathan, because he was such a great man. He was so good to David. There are not many men that come along, even in the Scriptures, that are like Jonathan, that would have had half of the integrity that Jonathan had in all these various circumstances regarding David. Because David, for most men in Jonathan's position, he would have been the single most hated man. Nobody would have hated David more than Jonathan, even more than Saul did, because Saul was the king, but David wasn't going to keep Saul from being king, but he was going to keep Jonathan from being king. And therefore, nobody would have hated David more than Jonathan, and yet, in reality, nobody loved David more than Jonathan did. And he saved his life multiple times because he loved God, and he loved what was right. All right, here's something we can learn. Just two things. I already said one of them from the beginning. There is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And that's what Jonathan was for David. And, hopefully we have a Jonathan in our lives. And if we don't, then why don't we be a Jonathan in somebody's life? And as the Hebrews writer said, another sad thing that we might expect, Jonathan doesn't even get a place in Hebrews 11. Make of it what you will, but he'd be in my Hebrews 11. I'm just saying. Of course, there is that reference to there's other men and women we could talk about if we'd had time. We'll put Jonathan in that category, but you might expect him to show up there by name, but he doesn't. But he does show up in spirit, because without faith it is impossible to please God. And Jonathan certainly was not lacking in faith. Yep.
When you look at Jonathan and then you look at Saul's other sons, Jonathan had courage. The others seem to be weak of spirit, let's say. And I know in this one it said, what did he say? His courage failed. Ishbosheth, one of his sons.
Yeah.
So when they went into battle, Jonathan always had courage. The others didn't.
Yep. And again, not just courage, but a fundamental respect and reverence for truth and right, both of which come from God. So I think that's what shaped who Jonathan was. A firm grasp in discerning good and evil, and being able to see it, each one, wherever it crops up, whether it's in a father or in a servant or whatever. He could see the good and the evil. Mm-hmm.
Even though Jonathan was able to serve with David, we know that David took care of his son, because he said,
Yeah. Yeah. Turns out there was a survivor in that slaughter. And that's another touching, moment later, that he finds out that Jonathan had a son that survived. Or was it a grandson? I think it was his son. It was his son, Saul's grandson. And he was, crippled. Jonathan had a son, and he treated him. He got to pay Jonathan back, as far, symbolically. for all that. Yep. So very, very moving. Yeah, he was able to keep, in the only way he could, he kept that oath. But all right, good examples for us. Jonathan's one of those men that we should follow after as far as that courage and that faith and that love, fundamental love of right and discerning right from wrong.